Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd weighs in on the apparent looming trade war between China and the U.S. Mr. Rudd sounds the alarm over the consequences of a tit-for-tat in raising tariffs. I also catch up with American businessperson Stephen Schwarzman, the chairman and CEO of Blackstone Group. He believes both China and the U.S. will steer away from a trade war because it's not in their interests. Meanwhile, we also approached Professor Graham Allison, the proponent of the idea Thucydides Trap, the tenuous situation between China as a rising power and the U.S., the existing power, the important lessons of history, in my interview with Professor Allison. We are bringing you a special edition of World Insight with me, Tian Wei, focusing on the trade dispute between China and the United States with high-profile interviews today. Now, last week, the Trump administration announced the tariffs on $60 billion worth of Chinese goods in an attempt to cut the trade imbalance with China. The move sparked the widespread fear of a massive trade war followed by tumbling stock markets across the globe. China has immediately taken countermeasures and announced tariffs on U.S. imports. Over the weekend, Beijing hosted the annual China Development Forum, where top international business leaders discussed the worrying prospects. So first, let's meet Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, who is not only a fluent Mandarin speaker, but more importantly, a longtime China observer, sharing his take on the trade tensions. Let's listen in. A lot of things going on these days.
Well, the world today is too interesting.
$60 billion tariffs against Chinese imports by the United States. Trump just did that. Your response?
Well, I have never supported tariff wars. I've never supported trade wars because trade wars are very easy to start and they're very hard to end. And so I'm concerned about this as a series of measures. I understand China will react in one way or another.
China already did?
I understand China's reaction will unfold. But the bottom line is this. We have to find a way of reintroducing stability in the US-China economic relationship because if that is unstable, then it will be bad not just for the two economies, it will be bad for the region and the world.
Yeah.
So I think there are different ways to solve the underlying problem here, which is the American conclusion concerning the size of the bilateral trade deficit.
One of the important things, Mr. Prime Minister, is to understand whether this is the tactic used by the United States because they started it, or is it going to be the very beginning of something much more serious than this, which would drag everybody down, the whole world? What do you think?
I think the bottom line is President Trump sees himself as the master tactician. As you know, in Chinese...
Do you see it that way too?
He sees it that way, and that is the Chinese word is 策略, but 策略 in Chinese does not equal 战略, and 战略 is the Chinese word for strategy. So we have to be clear about strategic objectives here. President Trump's strategic objective is to reduce the bilateral trade deficit. His tactic is to give everyone a dramatic example of what the United States is capable of doing through unilateral tariff measures. Now, will he succeed in his tactic? That is an entirely different matter. What I do notice, however, if you look beneath the surface, is that the substance of the American tariff measures and even the substance of the Chinese countermeasures do not go to the absolute heart of the bilateral trade relationship.
So you're saying?
What I'm saying is, therefore, this is an initial, very loud exchange of artillery, but really missing both targets. In order to demonstrate...
On purpose?
in order to demonstrate that these matters are taken seriously, while at the same time the negotiators privately are seriously hard at work trying to find an answer to how to bring about a staged and rapid increase in United States exports to China.
Even if there could be a tangle between the two, China and United States, with beautiful and dramatic steps, there could be a breakup of the possibility because of one party continue to be dramatic more than planned.
Well, the real danger here is that it gets out of control. The bottom line is, if this is a series of staged plays in both directions, underneath it all there's an opportunity to fix it. I would say right now that this is a 50-50 prospect.
You think? 50-50?
Yeah, whether it can be fixed underneath all the external drama. But if it's not fixed, as I said before, it's very easy to start a trade war. It's very hard to stop one. And then that's when you get to escalation, which then would go to the heart of each country's bilateral trade interests. And if that happens, then it's not just the effect on these two economies, it's the global economic impact, and then apart from that again, the impact on the existing rules-based system governing international trade, which we've developed for the last 75 years.
Let's touch on some of the crucial issues, Mr. Prime Minister, you just mentioned. One is about consensus, whether they are going to have some consensus. Most important thing, domestic politics as well. You understand, Mr. Prime Minister, more than anybody, while studying the United States over the past few years, that there is lack of consensus in Washington, and there's a lot of drama every day, and there's a different lineup of officials recently. So one would concern whether there is going to be any consistency when it coming to a consensus in Washington.
Well, the bottom line is, the more you observe Washington the last 12 months, the more you conclude one thing, and that is there's one decision maker, and his name is Donald Trump, because the other advisors to the decision maker come and go. So therefore, the critical question here is to look carefully at what Donald Trump says he wants. Secondly, what he says he wants is a halving, effectively, of the bilateral trade deficit between China and the United States from something in the order of $400 billion a year, currently in China's favour, to $200 billion a year. His domestic political constituency says that's important as well. He thinks the way to do that is either to get China to rapidly increase American exports to China, or to impose a whole bunch of tariffs to radically reduce American imports from China. So we need to pay attention to Trump himself, what he states as being important, and work within those parameters. If the interest is to preserve the stability in the overall US-China economic relationship, other advices at this stage I don't think matter all that much.
But, Mr. Prime Minister, it does matter. If you look at Trump, if you're saying he's the only general in charge in Washington, D.C., probably that's wrong. Look at the spending bill, $1.5 trillion. He did sign on it despite all the complaints he did just hours before that. So there are forces in Washington to rein him in. The question is whether those forces are in power or in the process of working on it, Mr. Prime Minister.
On the question of trade policy, you will find that the powers available to the presidency are much less constrained than they are in other areas of economic policy. And that is where the Congress can exercise all sorts of leverage. But on the current state of the tariff relationship, or the general trade relationship between China and the United States, the Executive Office of the Presidency has a large degree of latitude. And my simple observation, as someone who observes this, is that we need to look at what Mr. Trump is saying and work within those parameters, whether we think it's logical or whether we think it's illogical.
The other thing is, look at the example of Japan. 1960s, 1970s, even to early 1980s, with a span of 4 presidencies in the United States, making concessions, rather, to the United States on trade and economic issues, but not necessarily having a very promising result at the end of it. China, some say, should not follow that step. Concession is not the way. That's what many in China are saying.
Well, I think you need to take a broader view of this. China has done well out of the American market. Let's just call it for what it is. The fact that you earn $400 billion more each year than the Americans do out of this trading relationship is no bad thing for China. In fact, it's a very good thing for China. So if I was in that advantageous position, I think I would cut the Americans some slack and try to work constructively on how you actually boost American exports. And to be fair to Liu He and Xi, that's exactly what they're trying to do. The problem is, I don't think President Trump has given them enough time to do it. Hence why we're in this current boxing match over tariffs and counter-tariffs. And underneath it all, I hope that this work amongst the negotiators privately brings about a solution. If it doesn't, then frankly we escalate into a general trade war with the global consequences we've spoken of before. There is a way through, but as I said, it's only a 50-50 prospect.
But Mr. Prime Minister, you know the latter possibility is really a dramatic and disastrous one, because we are talking about if there is a trade war, the devastation of the international trade system, and that's going to drag everybody down. So at this point, Mr. Prime Minister, of course, China and the U.S. are in their tango, but what are the other players' roles are?
Well, I think the responsible action for all the other members of the World Trade Organization is to stand up and defend the rules of the system. Now, the rules of the system say that if you've got a dispute between two member states, then you use the dispute resolution mechanisms of the WTO to resolve that dispute.
We've seen some recent examples.
That's true. And at a smaller example, I can remember disputes involving my country and other countries, some of which we won and some of which we lost. That's the virtue of international law. It exists out there as an independent arbitral mechanism. It's useful. It's certainly better than going to war, trade war, or physical war. So therefore, the rest of the membership of the WTO need to be standing up and defending the system.
Are they standing up? Or they're rather looking for exceptions coming from the United States?
Well, understand that what they are doing at present is much like what China is doing, which is how do you deal with the current Trump reality? And so when Trump announces measures on steel and on aluminium, they say, well, I'd better try and get myself a carve-out. Do I think this is a good measure? No, I don't. But it's the reality, and they are still the number one. And so therefore, we've got to work with the parameters of that. My principled position as far as the rest of the trading system is concerned is that it's far better for member states of the WTO who are interested in sustaining the rules for the long term is to have a common position in defense of the rules. My greatest fear is the United States in a dispute with China, if it goes to arbitration on anything, and the United States loses and then walks away from the decision, it is at that point that the system collapses. You cannot have the number one economy in the world just saying, nah, it doesn't work, because then everyone else walks away as well. And that's where we go from an orderly international trade system to chaos and survival of the fittest.
But here's the thing. Nothing could depend on the good intention coming from the White House right now, right, Mr. Prime Minister? So is there any way that they will become, as you said, as rational as you are saying?
I think in the White House there would be a view that the collapse of the current international trading system is not desirable, even among those who are President Trump's closest supporters. So therefore, there will be a level of advice to him, including from his China hawks and including from his trade hawks, who will say, hey, we don't want to see the complete collapse of the system.
What does that take?
The complete collapse of the system?
No, but rather those that are around him to be able to persuade him.
It means that when push comes to shove, and if there is a dispute between China and the United States, and it goes to the WTO for arbitration, that the United States accepts the arbitration decision. Mind you, if it was to go against China, it would mean that China accepts the arbitration decision as well, within the WTO dispute resolution mechanisms. It's one of those things in international history. Sometimes the rules of international law, or international commercial law, or international trade law, are seen as only applying to small powers or middle powers and not to great powers. But strength is given to the system if the great powers also bind themselves to the rules as well.
Chinese President Xi Jinping, 1 year ago in Davos, made a great speech. You were there, Mr. Prime Minister. And he has been talking about China's commitment to the international system, including international trade system, and also about China's promises of further opening up and reform. Do you think these two remedies will still be the best to deal with the current situation, Mr. Prime Minister?
On the trade system, what China's economy needs and what the international economy needs is more global trade liberalization, not less. What it also needs, both domestically and internationally, is that when workers are hurt by particular industries being affected by trade liberalization, that we have a standard protocol which applies within our countries to deal with the adjustment for those firms and those workers. If you simply say that's bad luck, that you lose your job and you get, xia gang, which means you're out, then frankly that is where political reaction sets in. That's where the forces of economic nationalism take over and anti-trade sentiment becomes the dominant sentiment. So my view is we need more trade liberalization, not less. It's the best thing for working people. It creates more jobs and decreases prices for the things that workers need to buy, like a shirt, for example. But at the same time, for the workers who are badly affected, when a firm has to close or reduce, we must have a structural adjustment mechanism to assist them. On the other aspect of Xi Jinping's speech, which is the future of China's own domestic economic reform program, the reform achievement has been significant. I don't need to rehearse the numbers. All your viewers are familiar with them. But here's the challenge. When you announced the second wave of reform at the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee back in 2013, it's a very ambitious decision. And it was an integrated system of reforms, 60 or so individual recommendations covering everything from state and enterprise reform through to competition policy reform, foreign trade reform, foreign investment reform, land reform, labour reform, as well as environment reform, financial system reform, fiscal reform.
Right.
Now, in the last 5 years, China's progress in each of these areas has been uneven. Everyone knows that. International analytical community, China's own domestic analytical community. There's a range of reasons for that. Reform is hard because it disrupts things. So my encouragement to our Chinese friends would be to stay with that blueprint that you've announced, and when it means to go deeper in the implementation of those reforms, then it's necessary for China to bite the bullet and to continue to do that, however hard it gets.
Well, there are two things going on right now. One is institutionalized change. As you may know, there's institutional reform just adopted by the two sessions earlier. On the other hand, there's also the content. Where is the starting point of the spring that you have just talked about, the reforms? 3 so-called battles have been identified: environmental protection, poverty alleviation, risk reduction in the financial sector. Will these two be able to become the two guarding gods in a way to take this stage of reform further to the expectation?
The virtue of the 2013 blueprint was that it put the market at the center.
The decisive role, so-called.
So the virtue of that blueprint was that it connected the parts to the whole. I think the party leadership is right to say that the 3 battles that it points to are highly significant. You cannot have sustainable development unless you're dealing effectively with the environmental consequences development in every project. That's important, as is poverty elimination, those who are still in poverty to be taken out of poverty by 2020. And on top of that, systemic risks, of course, within the financial sector. These are important battlegrounds. But the rest of the program is of fundamental continuing importance as well. If you do this and transform China into, let's call it the new economic model, then frankly there's not going to be much that can stop China. And it'll be good for China and good for the world.
Will that be a good also strategy? Really what we are talking about is strategy rather than tactic, Mr. Prime Minister, for China to handle this trade dispute with the United States, these 2 ways
I think if you were to look at the full implementation of the blueprint of 2013, then frankly, over time, it deals with most of the problems the Americans are raising now,
right,
including competition policy, which means access to markets, including foreign trade reform and foreign investment reform, equitable treatment, etc. I think those things, together with intellectual property protection, actually deal with the substance of the American concern. It's just that we now have to speed everything up within, let's call it, a President Trump timetable.
China's agenda, what exactly is it? There are a lot of debates around the world, exactly what China is looking at, what China is looking at itself also as in the future. Your assessment here, whether it is Belt and Road, whether it's a community of shared future, or some of the other concepts, how will all these concepts in a way help you to understand where China wants to be and where China exactly is now?
And I've tried to explain it in terms of what I describe as 7 concentric circles. Let me give you one sentence on each. Number one, the world needs to understand that China is a Communist Party state. And so the Chinese Communist Party will continue as such. It's not about to suddenly democratize and become a Western democratic political party. That's not on the agenda. Westerners need to understand that reality. They may not agree with that reality, but that's the reality. Number two, China wishes to maintain domestic unity. And that's why Xinjiang, Xizang, but also Taiwan, particularly given what's happened with the Taiwan Travel Act, is so central to China's political authority. Number three, continue to increase living standards, eliminate poverty, and provide full employment. That's the economic agenda we've just been discussing. Four, expand China's influence across wider East Asia. And that's where China is doing that successfully through the strength of its economic presence. But it also is going to cause obvious frictions with the United States. That's what's happening too. 5, Belt and Road, and what you are doing across the Eurasian continent, what I describe as China's continental frontier. That also is an area where China is expanding its economic influence, and through that its foreign policy influence as well. I think number 6 is, if you look wider in the world, in Europe and in Africa and Latin America, China is also becoming the significant economic player, not just through development assistance, 援助方面的, but in other areas as well, so that China's status across the world increases, and that's happening. And finally, what I see also with concepts such as what Xi Jinping has argued for, a concept of a shared future for all humanity, 人类命运共同体, is that this can help build a new consensus in terms of the values underpinning the future of the global order, 国际秩序, because that's where China also is active now in influencing the rules of the economic system, the rules of the international system. But what we need to do is to make sure this doesn't end in conflict, but that we can base it on a set of internationally shared values, which is where Xi Jinping's contribution can be quite important.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks for having me on the program. Good to be in Beijing.
Our interview with Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, talking about the latest issues between China and the United States. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come. Prominent American businessman Stephen Schwarzman shrugs off a possible trade war between China and the U.S. He says tariffs are not in anyone's long-term interest. That conversation right after this break. You are watching a special edition of World Insight with me, Tian Wei, focusing on the U.S.-China trade dispute with high-profile interviews. Next, let's meet Stephen Schwarzman, an American businessman and investor. He is a Republican and certainly has been the advisor to President Donald Trump for some time. He became known to China when he announced a $100 million personal gift to establish the Schwarzman Scholars Program housed at Tsinghua University, whose founding received congratulatory letters both from the U.S. and Chinese presidents. He told me he does not believe a trade war is coming, as it is not in anyone's long-term interest. But the structural trade imbalance between China and the United States has to be fixed. But the question is, how and when? Schwarzman, what a pleasure to see you again.
Good to see you.
Few days of stay in Beijing.
Always. I enjoy coming to Beijing.
Particularly this time, I guess, a lot of drama going on between China and the United States.
It's a little more colorful a time than usual.
Can we still handle it?
I think so.
But how to figure it out? The 60 billion, that seems to be already starting some kinds of rhetoric for war. Is there a war looming?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Because it's not in anyone's long-term interest. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do something that's productive.
China and the United States, Mr. Schwarzman, as you may know, has been working on a plan to make the business balanced and the trade more balanced. It seems that since 5 years ago, there have been a lot of talks already about it, and some roadmap already been drawn. But the thing is, whether the timetable of the current White House is matching up with the blueprints of making progress on that imbalance between the two sides. What do you think about that, in a way, divide between the timetable of the White House and the timetable of many others who have participated in that roadmap building, including yourself?
Well, what I guess I could say, and not really being an apologist.
You could say, or you want to make just politically correct statements.
No, what's happening is that the trade deficit between the two countries keeps getting larger and larger. There is a need to address that.
Will war help? Will war help?
I was going to say, how it gets addressed is not something that I determine.
Not you determine, but you are one of those most important, influential business person. You have also been the leadership of many of the American companies interacting with the current White House and the policymakers. Sir, your opinion is important. It's time for people like you with clear minds and sound logic to speak up.
I'm not a government official.
No, you're not.
Which in my country is probably a good thing. I like to have win-win outcomes. And I believe you can have that in this scenario. I think you have to look through sort of the current noise and concentrate on what does it take to reset in a productive way economic relationship between the two countries. China is remarkable and will continue to be remarkable. So dealing with some of these, I would almost call them historical trade issues, is probably a good idea because it resets a relationship. Part of what causes this type of action on the part of the United States and eventually other developed countries is the loss of jobs, the loss of growth rate, and the loss of prosperity to technology and to aspects of globalization. It's not about Donald Trump and the current administration.
What do you think, sir, is the next step for both sides to reset this relationship?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a trade war. I think that the Chinese are sufficiently measured and intelligent that, of course, they would respond to something.
But what about the other side keep on pushing? You never know what exactly is the agenda of President Trump. Do you know?
Well, I think the agenda is actually pretty simple, which is to normalize relations between the two countries and have something that's fair.
So you think the current White House would do it with logic?
I think at the end of the day, sure.
At the end of the day, how long is the end of the day? That's the problem.
Well, I think that logic should prevail because we all have to live in the world together, and we're all looking for a productive way. I don't think there's a need to inflame the situation from either side. I think, you know, this is an opportunity for both countries to engage to have a positive long-term outcome.
Before we go, Mr. Schwarzman, final question for you. China has been talking about reform and opening up the financial sector, which you have been working on for decades as an important area. I wondered, have you learned something about latest information related to the 19th Party Congress and also to the latest two sessions in which the roadmap has already been set up, but at the same time stressing the reduction of risks in the financial sector?
China's got a positive outcome, positive attitude, I should say, in terms of opening sectors. And I think the more rapidly that's done, consistent with prudence, is a good thing for China, and it's a good thing for the rest of the world.
Okay. Mr. Schwarzman, it was a pleasure to see you once again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Stephen Schwarzman, a very well-established American business person who has been very busy recently between China and the United States. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on our program, history could tell us valuable lessons in fixing today's conflicts. Professor Graham Allison, the proponent of Thucydides Trap, may be onto something in understanding China and the U.S. relations. That history lesson from Professor Allison right after this break. Yes, this is World Insight. You're watching a special program of our program today, which is focusing on the U.S.-China trade dispute with a series of heavyweight interviews. Now let's meet Graham Allison, who is a prominent American political scientist. He has been heavily involved in the U.S. foreign and defense policy in the 1960s and 70s when the U.S. was dealing with the former Soviet Union. He is best known for his research on Thucydides Trap, to refer to the situation when a rising power causes fear in an established power which escalates toward war. He applied the term to the relationship between the United States, the existing power, and China as a rising power. But he said that Thucydides Trap is something both countries could and should avoid. But to steer away from a physical war or the potential of a trade war, the question is, once again, how? Thucydides Trap, something you warned between China and the United States. Is it on the way to come, given the latest trade dispute?
I would say that Thucydides is probably watching carefully and saying everybody is on script. So unfortunately, I think the storyline looks like it's emerging. Yeah.
What exactly is that storyline?
Well, the storyline is with a rising power, like Athens 2,500 years ago, or Germany 100 years ago, or China today, threatens to displace a ruling power, like the U.S. today. In general, the outcome is a war, catastrophic war. Now, not in all the cases. I look at the last 500 years, I find 16 cases when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, 12 of them in war, 4 of them in not war. So to say war inevitable would be a big mistake. So we hope this will be the fifth case of no war, not the 13th case.
You could argue now things are more connected than ever before.
Yes.
And probably this is a good thing.
Yes, and because that provides some ballast in the relationship. We have a great stakes in working together, but in this relationship in which, on the one hand, China feels bigger, stronger, deserves more say, more sway, feels like it's being confined, and the Americans think, wait a minute, we have to cling to the status quo because this is the order that's provided all.
Is the 60 billion tariffs on Chinese goods a sign of U.S. trying to maintain its power? Is that how it is?
I think Thucydides would say that's the kind of thing the ruling power might do, being threatened and fearful of the rising power, and imagining that these small actions would have some impact when actually they may be counterproductive.
That's exactly what I meant. In a way, is it going to help the incumbent power, or is it going to hurt the incumbent power?
Again, Thucydides would tell us that the behavior is one thing. It's thought to be constructive, but it's often destructive. So if you look at the ways in which Sparta felt obliged to come to the relief of Corinth, even though it didn't like Corinth and thought Corinth was acting against its interest, it still felt, I should do this, and then one thing leads to the other, and pretty soon they find themselves where they don't want to be. And I think a trade conflict in particular, if it escalated, could get both China and the U.S. doing things that, even though they don't make any sense, their blood is up, they're feeling the other one is pushing me around, and under those circumstances, it becomes very dangerous.
Do you think the U.S. side would have any way of coming back to logic?
I certainly hope so, because I live in the U.S.
But what is backing you of thinking and hoping so?
Well, I say partly that I'm an optimistic person. I'm always hopeful. But I think that in the dynamics of the U.S., often there's an overreaction at one stage to which then the rest of the system pushes back a bit. And I think as people look at the danger in the relationship between the U.S. and China, there's some reason for thinking that it'll stabilize. But I would say not yet. And if I were betting, things will get worse before they get worse.
You mean the tariffs will be even higher?
Well, I think the 90 days is the beginning of it, but I think an even more interesting, and what Thucydides again teaches us, is that in this tense relationship or this dangerous dynamic, each misunderstands the other. So even when one or the other is trying to be helpful or trying to be more sensible, the other says, oh, well, I think it has an ulterior motive. So I think the risk of misunderstanding is very great, and then when you have great misunderstandings, the risk of misjudgments and mistakes become very large. So I think that's why communication between people and between the governments is so important.
Communication, whether it is successful or not, is based on trust, to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yes.
But we are not seeing many cases of trust between this administration in Washington, D.C. and the current Chinese government, for example. Both of them are new, and yet we haven't seen anything that would come here as the basis for trust. Do we?
Well, it's a good question. So I think that sometimes Chinese talk about mutual trust, but if you look at the statement in the 19th Party Congress, it backs up a little bit, and it says mutual respect rather than trust. So I may not trust you, but I may have enough respect for you that we talk with each other, and I'm not sure you're telling the truth all the time. You're not sure I'm telling the truth all the time, but we're talking and we're listening and we're trying to understand. So I would say the first instance, mutual respect and some appreciation for each other's core interests.
One of the things, Professor Allison, is whether we have in your system any forces that would help to go back onto the track of discussion and negotiation.
Well, I think that they are in the system, and I think they will be even more so.
Who are they?
So the business community is one part, and especially the parts of the business community that know that they have the biggest stakes in China. So there's a lot of American companies that are very active in China. There's a lot of trade between the U.S. and China. There's a lot of people who consume goods that are made in China. So all those voices, as they discover that their interests are being threatened, will become, I think, more important. Whether they'll be sufficient to deal with the Trump administration, which has a very strong view on this matter, and a very unusual view, that is at least a view that's sharply different than the consensus view for the previous 3 or 4 decades, that's an uncertainty. Yeah.
Earlier in your panel discussion, people have been using the analogy of adult and child. I'm not sure whether it is the most appropriate to discuss of the matters between states, but the question is, the apparent child has a lot of power in hand. Where is the stabilizing factor that you are talking about?
My hope is that as we recognize the stakes for each of the parties, that you'll find more people in the system, in Congress, of which there are a number of people, in the business community, in the think tank community, and academic community like myself, saying, let's try to understand the bigger picture in which we have many vital interests between the U.S. and China, have been having serious competition, can be very constructive, but it needs to be within a framework. So I think what we need to be doing is thinking how in this difficult transition and in this difficult dynamic, because it is true that China is getting bigger and stronger, and it is true that that has an impact on Americans and their consciousness and their role in the world. So trying to cope with this requires a great leap of imagination.
That's our interview with Graham Allison, who has been researching about Thucydides Trap and suggesting that China and the United States should really avoid that. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.